I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, I'm John.
This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We're here for the sober curious, the new guy, and the old timer. We're here to talk about the stuff anyone looking to live alcohol-free has to face day to day, and how we overcame those struggles. We speak for no 12-step group, but we do try to remain anonymous. You're not alone. This is the Sober Friends Podcast. All right, happy birthday to us. We're 2 years old now. We're into our third year of podcasting. And when you get past 100 episodes and you're moving on to episode 101, you start to have return guests, especially ones that have really interesting stories when you haven't touched the surface. And we're bringing back a returning guest from just a couple episodes ago, Pete B. Pete B is pretty well involved in Narcotics Anonymous. Not what we typically talk about here, but this is my view. You tell me if I'm wrong, boys. My view is anybody who has an addiction, we're all the same.
Absolutely.
You know, if you got a Coke addiction, you got an alcohol addiction, I can identify with you. And I realized, thought about this, that I know NA exists, but I don't know the history. I know the history of AA. It starts in 1938. Bill W. and Dr. Bob started it. But I don't know when NA started and what their organization is like. That's a lot of interesting stuff to go over. So John and Steve, welcome to the show. And Pete, welcome back again.
Thanks. It's great to be back, Matt. Thanks a lot. John and Steve, good to see you guys again.
Nice to have you, Pete.
It's interesting that you guys asked me to come talk about the history of NA, because back in 1982 and 1983, my job was to put together the history of NA for NA.
Huh.
That was my job, and
jackpot.
And nobody had done that before.
Well, they had done it cursorily, but they wanted someone to do a deep dive, and I had sort of cut my teeth on the putting together of the NA Basic Text, which was our big book. And just at the conference where we completed that project, I was elected the vice chair of the World Literature Committee, and I had no idea what that meant. So I asked the chair, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, we really need somebody to go deep on the history of NA, because they just sort of had the outline, but they wanted somebody to do some research, and I liked that kind of stuff. I've always loved history, so for the next 2 years, I was consumed by the history of NA, and I learned so much that we didn't know about. So I have a few things. I'm not going to spend too much time on the early history, but there are some significant facts and significant people that should be talked about.
Yeah, let's start. When did it start? I know it's not the 1930s, but give us a date of when it starts.
Okay, the official the official word on when NA started is a meeting in Van Nuys, California, in October of 1953. However, in my research and some research that some other people did even deeper than I did, we learned that the roots of NA extend back to 1935.
Oh wow! So pre-AA.
Well, I'll tell you, wasn't NA then, but the roots are there. In 1935, in May of 1935, which is about a month before Bill met Bob W. In June of 1935. So it's really interesting. They're so interconnected. They never had anything. I mean, hell, they really didn't have much to do with alcoholics up until AA got started, but they really didn't know what to do with drug addicts. And they had a problem in the prison in the prisons in the United States. They had a real problem with addiction. Was starting to become a problem there, and they started what they called the narcotic farm, or Narco, in Lexington, Kentucky, and that became the place for the next 20 years. That was the place for drug addicts to go. They were put there by the prison, but people could also voluntarily go there, and they would go there to get the cure. And a fellow named Dr. Tom M. from North Carolina, Shelby, North Carolina. He was a doctor who he was an alcoholic, but he had about a 10-year addiction to one of those drugs that doctors have access to, and he wound up going to the farm, and while he was there in 1939, which was the year the AA Big Book came out, and while he was there happened to be a copy of the Big Book at the farm. He picked it up. He got the cure or whatever, he came back to Shelby, North Carolina, and he and a few other AA members got NA started in North Carolina. They started the first AA meeting in North Carolina. So Dr. Tom Emmon, he's kind of known as the first addict outside of just alcohol who got clean, found recovery through AA.
So it sounds like what they did is they needed something for their drug habit, and AA was available, and it was easier just to start a new chapter where they were of AA to handle their addiction.
Yeah, well, and for Dr. Tom, it worked. You know, he picked up the principles, he got himself a sponsor, and it worked. He got clean. You know, he found recovery through the 12 steps in the big book, and the rest was history for AA in North Carolina. Now, Dr. Tom didn't forget where he came from, and he advocated that the farm, the narco farm in Lexington, he advocated that they start up a 12-step group for addicts, but he wasn't in a position to do anything about it. He would just kind of put it out there into the universe. Well, a fellow named Houston S. was an alcoholic, and he found recovery. And he moved. He was one of these people that was just on fire with carrying the message. He moved to 20 miles away from the farm, and when he realized what was going on at the farm, he said, "Hey, this stuff ought to work for drug addicts too." So he went over and he advocated starting what they then called Addicts Anonymous. They used the AA Big Book. They used the principles of AA, and it continued to be used there through the late 60s. That the Addicts Anonymous got started there. So a guy named Danny C. was from New York City. He was at the farm. He first tried the cure at the farm in 1935. He was one of their first patients. Well, he was in and out about 8 times, and he'd do fine while he was there. He'd get out, and he just couldn't. The cure didn't work for him in day-to-day life. Well, when he went back for the 8th time, they had just started up the Addicts Anonymous meetings, and he got it. He found recovery through the AA principles. He came back to New York City, and he was going to start an Addicts Anonymous meeting in New York City. And I think he might have talked to somebody at the General Service Office, and they suggested that he find a different name that wouldn't be so similar to that wouldn't also have the same acronym. So he came up with Narcotics Anonymous. So that predates the 1953 thing I told you about. They started, so there were NA meetings in New York City in 1949, 1950. And this was before the Rockefeller laws, which the Rockefeller laws were something that came to be an issue in the late 60s and the 70s, where, and particularly in New York, addicts were prohibited to gather. So they couldn't have a meeting of addicts, even if they were trying to recover. So that prohibited. But anyway, that wing of that part of Narcotics Anonymous, which really isn't related to the Narcotics Anonymous that I got clean in, other than the name. They came up with the name, and Jimmy K. So let me fast forward to Jimmy K now. Jimmy K is a guy. He was originally from Philadelphia, and he'd moved out to California, and he got clean in AA in 1950. And he tended to gravitate towards the other addicts like himself that were getting clean and in AA. And he had a dream, like a nightmare, once when he was coming up on 3 years, and in his dream there were addicts dying all around him. And he woke up from the dream, and he felt awful. He felt terrible. He was close to being suicidal. He felt so bad. And then he talked to his friends about it, and they started talking about it, and they started, they said, you know what? We were the lucky ones. We were able to come in here and get this message. He said, but they knew that a lot of their addict friends were having trouble. Finding that, they were having identification trouble. So they eventually, and Jimmy actually was, I think he actually talked to Bill W. And Bill W. put him in touch with this Danny C., who had this Narcotics Anonymous meeting going in New York.
So I want to back up a bit because I'm hearing Narcotics Anonymous started in 53, but there's this Addicts Anonymous that also becomes Narcotics Anonymous. Are these merging? Does one have a linked history to the other?
Yeah, the main, when push comes to shove, the main association they have is the name, because they weren't really they sort of had their own twist on it. There was they really didn't embrace traditions at all. Traditions were just really being developed then, but Jimmy was kind of always right from the start. He learned about the traditions in his discussions with Bill W. And he was convinced that we need the traditions to survive. They had actually, that group in New York had their adaptation of the 12 steps, which they got permission from AA to do. Their first step said we're powerless over, I think originally it said over narcotics, and then it said they were powerless over drugs. And they had a 13th step.
Yeah, buddy.
Is it the same as our 13th?
The 13th step was simply God help us. And the long form was, this idea is incumbent in all 12 of these steps that we have to have a higher power to help us. And they just thought it necessary to add that 13th step there.
Is that still in there today? Or is it still?
Well, they're not. They didn't survive. They lasted. That wing lasted until the late '60s as well.
Right.
And then they kind of got absorbed when NA finally got going in New York City in the early '80s. Any remainder from that wing sort of got absorbed into NA as we know it. So anyway, so it got started in '53 in earnest out there in Southern California, and a very significant thing that they did was, when they also got permission to adapt the 12 steps. And then the first step, they had to they considered this for a while. And, they didn't know, they wanted to be all inclusive to anybody, any kind of drug addict, including alcoholics, if that was the thing. And so instead of naming a substance in the first step, they said powerless over addiction, period. Because that powerless over the condition, the disease of addiction. And then another thing they did was they put we at the beginning of every step except for the 12th step. Where in AA it's implied.
Right.
It says we before the first step, and then it's implied with the rest of the steps. They added the we to all of them.
Pete, just to go back to that, I just want to put a pin in something there, because here's a couple things that strike me is where you're talking, just like Matt said, you're talking about those two different groups, and you're saying, well, the only thing they had in common was the name. Again, that resembles the early days of AA, where you had the Akron group and the New York group, right? And if you read the history, which I know Matt's talked about, and I've read the book, they were practicing fairly different programs at that time.
Absolutely.
Very different.
Yep.
Right? So it sounds like this, and again, I don't think this was planned this way, but it sounds like the rise of NA sort of followed that same path. Like you had these two different groups sort of trying to figure it out, and then all of a sudden it coalesces into a single group that starts to put together things. So it's pretty interesting. And the only other thing I want to just put in there is that I've always, when I read the big book, Bill Wilson talks about being drug addicted, right?
Yes.
He talks about being an addict. And I've always felt that it was kind of strange that I was just telling my wife about tonight's podcast, and saying how, when we first came in, especially when you came in, Pete, and when John came in, and even when I came in the first time at 95, like you couldn't walk into an AA meeting and say, I'm an addict. They would say, there's another program, get out of here, right?
Yep.
Although Bill Wilson openly talked about that he had addiction problems too.
It's in the big book.
Yeah. So it's just interesting that I just want to sort of put that pin in how those two groups were out there, one in New York, the other one, and like all of a sudden they become this one group. So.
Well, it's kind of funny. Up until I was doing my research in '82 and '83, nobody had ever heard of this other NA.
Oh, okay.
They had faded from history, and they just sort of like went the way of history. And as I was digging, I was digging through a lot of old articles and this is before the internet too. So I'm like just doing a lot of research.
Right.
And
microfiche, Dewey Decimal.
did some microfiche, and I was finding articles. I found an article, I think in a Saturday Evening Post or something. There was an article that referenced Narcotics Anonymous in New York City, and it was before 1953. And I'm like, and somewhere along I heard a reference about a book. There's a book about low blood sugar that talked about Narcotics Anonymous in it. And I was looking all over for this book, and this was really one of those moments when you say, okay, there's something bigger than me going on here. Me and this girl that I was seeing at the time were on our way out to a cabin in West Virginia, and we stopped in a bookstore in Winchester, Virginia, just looking around at books. And this old guy in the store, I think he worked there. And I wasn't talking about this or anything, but this old guy, he comes moseying over by me, and he reaches up on the shelf and he pulls this book off the top shelf and he hands it to me and says, "Here, you might need this." It's that goddamn book on low blood sugar. And I looked at it, and when my girlfriend knew about that book that I'd been looking for it, and we just had that that Twilight Zone kind of thing in the background there.
So you didn't ask for it there; the book just came to you.
It just came, and that just was like wow.
Yeah.
And the more we did research, we learned a lot about this guy, Danny C. Danny Carlson was his name. And turns out he died in 1956. And a friend of mine he was from Philadelphia, lives down in Fort Lauderdale now, but he became such a passionate NA history guy. He went and found where Danny Carlson was buried. And he was buried with just like a stone or something there. And he went out, he took up a collection, and he got a headstone as a tribute to Danny Carlson, because he saw Danny Carlson as he was one of our most significant predecessors, because he is somebody who had gotten clean with these principles and went back and got NA going. And even though that NA didn't wind up combining with ours, it was kind of interesting.
Now, that's kind of different from AA. I mean, AA back in the early days and really up until probably the early 2000s, anonymity was like, that was key. And you didn't say your last name, and God forbid, you're an alcoholic, got out into the world. And, here and everybody, doesn't matter who you are, whether in recovery or, just a regular person walking the street. Everybody knows who Bill Wilson is, but yet his gravestone up in Manchester, Vermont just has William G. Wilson, and he was a World War I veteran. That's it. Plain, simple, basic VA type headstone, but it's loaded with coins. I mean, just loaded. And the same thing with Ebby Thatcher up in Albany. There's no mention on his gravestone that he was a pivotal part in alcohol, the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous. And as we find out tonight, it's probably an offshoot of NA, because this all, 1934, the world was just breaking loose with all these ideas, and recovery was possible. And And it makes sense to me that 1935, you have these different groups in Akron and New York, and now you have the NA portion, that it all came together at the same time, like Steve was saying. And then you find this book. Is this a coincidence? I don't think so. These things happen for a reason.
Yeah, they really do. They really do.
Yeah.
So NA really struggled. The NA, as we know it, really struggled through the 50s. There was like a very dynamic personality who sort of kind of took over. And it wasn't Jimmy. In fact, I think this guy sort of, he was a guy. He had actually been a professional pitcher. He'd actually pitched a third of an inning for the Philadelphia Phillies at one time, and he went on to be like a character actor or whatever for a little while in Hollywood. But while this dominant personality was sort of like running the roost in the 50s, and not much happened. They had a lot of other problems too, because back then. Law enforcement was very wary of addicts, drug addicts. Drug addicts had a real bad name, and it got worse in the 60s. So they had a problem with the surveillance going on. There were a lot of people that were afraid to go to NA meetings because they were afraid there'd be undercover cops in the meetings, and they'd bust them, or that there'd be drug dealers hanging out outside the meetings, and that did happen sometimes. So there was a lot of things working against it. But this guy, Jimmy K, one of the reasons he was one of a group that started that first meeting in October of '53, But one of the reasons he's kind of really become the Bill W. of NA was he was the one who kept saying, we got to follow these traditions. We got to stick to this thing. And in 1959, NA almost completely went away. That group that had been sort of running it through the 50s, it fizzled. It fell apart. And Jimmy and a couple of other addicts who had a little clean time under their belt, they got together and they said, how can we make this thing work? And and they decided that everyone agreed that we're gonna follow the traditions to a T. At that point, the traditions were a thing, and Jimmy was the one. This guy Bob B. His story in the basic text was, I found the only NA meeting in the world, because he showed up right when they were down to one meeting. Actually, they didn't even meet for 4 months. So there, in many ways, NA as we know it didn't really begin until late 1959, because from that point forward, but very slowly and steadily grew from that point. But they never got down to one meeting again after that.
Yeah, but not like AA, where AA starts and there's only steady growth from the beginning and sort of a more centralized thing. This feels more like an offshoot of, we're trying to feel our way because we've got nothing else, and we have a little bit of a roadmap with AA, but that's about what we got, and maybe there are people here and we'll drift in and out. Do you know at that time, like, was there a dominant drug that people were fighting at that time? Were there multiple things?
Heroin. It was the early members were predominantly heroin addicts, and heroin and morphine, and these were the primary in those early days, and that's kind of where Narcotics Anonymous name kind of fit, and in that NA of the 50s, it was almost like if you weren't a heroin addict, you didn't count.
Yeah.
It was really needle centric, and they even though they'd done a really good thing when they instead of going with the substance said addiction, they still were very kind of focused on that, and that started to change with that group that started it back up in 59. From that point forward, they started doing a lot of things right. They developed their original literature was a thing. They actually had developed a little pamphlet called that was known as the Buff Book, probably around 56. And then in the early 60s, when they resurrected things, they put together what's been known forever as the Little White Book. And in the Little White Book, they had a lot of different key information. There was 8 different sections in it. One was the steps, one was the traditions, one was who is an addict, why are we here? Let's see, what is NA? We do recover was the last chapter of that, and it was just a little white book. And they came out with that in 62 and 66, and Jimmy was the primary author of that one. So Jimmy is emerging as the Bill W. right of NA. And in 66, they added some personal stories to the back of that little white book. So they had about 6 personal stories. And, up through the late 70s, well, I'd say up throughout the 60s, NA never got past California. It did spread from Southern California to Northern California, even got up into Washington State and Oregon. But it kind of stayed pretty central there. They started to, as the 70s happened, the way NA spread to east of the Mississippi was this guy named Roy P. from Philadelphia had a grandmother in Southern California, and he was out visiting his grandmother, and he was a guy struggling. He was an addict who was struggling to get clean in AA, and he was at an AA clubhouse in somewhere around Hollywood, and he's sitting in the back, and this fellow sitting beside him, said, I think this guy's an addict. And he hands him a little white book, and he says, here, take this, this might help you. And that guy sitting beside him was Jimmy K. And that Roy brought the little white book back to Philadelphia. He shared it with a few friends. They started a meeting in Philadelphia. Then he wound up going out to a rehab up in central Pennsylvania, and he brought that little white book with him out there. And they got NA going. They got the first NA meeting in an institution east of the Mississippi, and NA took root at that point in Philadelphia. That was the first time it comes east of the Mississippi, and it remained. It grew from there in Philadelphia, spread into New Jersey. Early 70s, it picked up in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. Got some NA meetings going.
Now, is this the old NA? Just so I'm following along.
This is the NA as we know it.
Okay.
So it's starting to spread a little bit, but it's still really, really, really slow growth. And they started having conventions. They started having world conventions, and all the conventions are in California. And in 72, they started talking about an NA big book. Hey, maybe if we wrote our own book, and they talked about it, and they talked about it. They put a message out to to all the known groups at the time, and they didn't get very much back,
This is hard to get my head around because I'm used to the AA way where there seems to be, this is more of like creation through the Big Bang, that Bill writes the book, they get the book going, and there's AA that goes from place to place, and it grows from like this inflection point where it feels like the story you're telling here, NA is like kind of lingering in the mist outside the orbit of AA, very slowly growing, regionalized in the country, but for the most part, not really a literature of its own. So this is sort of backwards. We're having these meetings, we're doing the stuff, spreading word of mouth, and hey, it's been like a decade or so. Maybe we should put something down in writing.
Yeah.
Very backwards.
So absolutely. Well, here's what part of the problem was. The NA owes, an unbelievable debt to AA. But for many, many years, NA was unhealthily dependent on AA. Addicts would get clean in NA, then they go to AA to find recovery. And because that's where the good literature was, that's where the long-term sobriety was, that's where the people that had the experience were. So it just became a common thing. NA was still good for the identification for that newcomer. But they would come to NA to get clean, and then they go to AA, and then they'd stay. They stay in AA because AA worked for them at that point. They got past the identification part. And, I mean, to this day, I don't think there's as good a document on recovery as the Big Book of AA,
Right.
And we got
That's
people
gold
that
standard.
have had years experience working with that. It's hard to improve on that. So I'm going to introduce two other characters who are very significant characters to NA's growth beyond that little hub out there. A guy named Greg P. gets clean. And Greg P. had a lot of corporate experience, right? But he also, he was able to have some insight, and they were trying. Somehow he wound up on the world board like at 4 years clean or whatever. So it's around 75, and Greg is saying, you know what, the big problem that I'm seeing here, because everyone's trying to figure out how come NA is having such a hard time growing, and Greg's like, well, every one of us we're going to both programs, and that's great. It's wonderful that we're able to go to both, but half the people go to A and then they don't come back.
There's nobody to share an example. So you're illustrating the point on why the 30-year-old grizzled, angry, grumpy old drunk is important in the AA meeting. Because you have to have somebody with really good sobriety for a long time and knows their stuff, who can teach the new people the right way to do this. Yeah. And I say grizzled old grumpy old man in the nicest way possible.
Oh yeah.
This is why we keep going to meetings, because it helps me to teach somebody else. And if you're brand new and you don't have anybody to look up to or an example to set, you could get thrown off the primrose path. And here, if you're going to NA meetings and it's just newcomers who don't really know much, that's not a great start.
Yeah. You pretty much grasped exactly what the problem was here.
Through your research, did it show why it was taking so long for it to evolve? I mean, with AA, 1930, Bill gets sober in 1934. 35, really, AA starts together with Bill and Bob, but 1939, they write their book. So 4 years, they went from two guys to the first 100 or something like that. Yeah, but it's like Matt said, it seems a decade or 2 decades that it took to get this thing moving. Was there anything that would point to why?
Multiple factors. Yeah. I think chief among them was the fact that we had AA. We stayed very dependent on AA. When I showed up in 1980, that was still going on in Philadelphia. Everything was mixed up. If I wanted to do a 30 and a 90 and 90, I was going to 3 NA meetings and 4 AA meetings a week, because I had 3 NA meetings that were within my realm, and plenty of AA meetings. So I did that for my first 90 days. I did that, but that's a little ahead of the story. I'm going to walk you through the 70s. So Greg Peace, he's the first one. Now you got a bunch of people out there in California now that got like 15, 20 years clean, but they're still very much mixed up between the two programs. And Greg Peace says, I'm going to stake my life and my recovery on NA. I'm sticking to NA, and everyone said, you're crazy. You're crazy. You can't do that. And Greg's kind of like, well, somebody's got to start it. And Greg drew a line in the sand, and that line was a very significant line, because he started this idea that, okay, he had the insight that this is part of what's stunting our growth. It's like, the kid needs to get out of the home, right? You have to get away from the parents. You have to rebel a little bit before you can kind of come into your own. And NA had to do that. And they did it. Greg started it. So they had, there was a convention in San Francisco in 1977. And this cat from Atlanta named Bo S. Bo S was this guy. He did a lot of like street social work in the early 70s. He had a real compassion for kids who were getting strung out in drugs and stuff like that. Now, he was an addict himself. He wasn't a hardcore, needle freak, but he was an addict. But he watched these kids there was just nothing for them. They would just die. And he grew a real compassion for doing something about this. And in the process, he realized that he was an addict too. So he got clean initially in AA. And then NA got going in Atlanta in the early 70s. So he gravitated to NA, and and he was like, he was really aware he knew the drug culture like the back of his hand, and he could see that and this whole NA relationship with AA wasn't helping the addict that he saw on the streets. It wasn't helping them at all. They couldn't relate.
Do you have any idea of how successful addicts were crossing over to AA at that time, before NA was really a mature thing?
There were, I would say that probably for every addict that successfully did that, there were 10 that couldn't. Some because AA didn't want to hear about drugs. They didn't. The 30-year sober old grizzled guy was steeped in the tradition. Is like that's not our primary purpose. Take that somewhere else.
Bullshit.
Right.
And that was still going on, at least in my home group between the last 5-7 years. It wasn't until, like you said, a lot of those really old timers that were just stuck in their ways, that passed on, and in my home group, we got, there's a whole bunch of guys in their 30s and 40 years of sobriety. They're open to it. It's no longer that hardcore alcohol discussion only. It's all the same. And if you got to talk about drugs, you got to talk about drugs. If you got to talk about food or sex or anything else, it's part of your recovery. And if it affects your recovery and your sobriety,
do you think that's a fentanyl thing with fentanyl coming into the picture and kind of changing the game, or do you think that's?
It happened before then. It was I think the timing was perfect when the fentanyl, guys like JP that passed, and the other guy, Carl, I think his name was. Well, we had a stint there about 4 years ago. People every 2 weeks somebody was dying. They were in meetings, and then they would. They sounded great. Jeremy, that's the guy's name. They sounded great. They sounded like they had the world on fire. They had like a year or so, and then all of a sudden, boom, out for a run, and they died. Yeah.
They had the share of a lifetime that would reach the 30-year-old person, and then they were dead the next day.
Yeah.
That's so heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
When that happens. When you get to know them, right?
Yep.
But so this guy, Bo, he gets clean, and he starts saying, he's saying, where's the NA literature? And they'd hand him this little white book, and he'd say, well, come on, like AA's got this big book. Where's ours? And
so what does the little white book look like? What's in that?
It's like it was like 6 pamphlets put together, and they have
really rudimentary.
If you go to an NA meeting today, all the readings that you hear at the beginning of the meeting are what was the little white book. Because NA does a lot more reading at the beginning of a meeting than AA does.
Yes, they do.
They spend 5-10 minutes reading, and all that stuff that you hear at the beginning. Some of it has been modified a bit from then, modified for more appropriate language for today, and stuff like that. But for the most part, that's the guts of what that little white book was, and that little white book would become the framework of our basic text. The first 8 of our 10 chapters were the 8 sections of that book. That was a decision that actually this Greg had suggested that. So anyway, Greg becomes this guy who's and he's on the board now, and this guy Bo goes out to his first convention in 1977, and he's so all the heavyweights in NA are there, and he starts asking everybody, what's going on with the book? What's going on in the book? And they keep handing them off one to the other. And eventually somebody points them to Greg, and Greg lays down the truth and says, Bo, nothing's happening with the book. And Bo's like, well, how can nothing be happening? And Greg said, well, maybe you need to be the one that starts it. And Bo took that to heart. And Bo, there's in our archives, there's a wonderful letter that later that year, Bo sends a letter to Greg P. and he says, hey, Greg, guess what? I got a typewriter for Christmas. and so Bo starts working on stuff, but he's not really a writer, but Bo is this guy with a tremendous gift of pulling people together. He's worked on the streets in Atlanta. He knows how to work especially with addicts. And so he quickly becomes the chairman of the World Literature Committee. And he's charged with with taking up the book project. And of course, everybody, they've been talking about a book since 1972. So everybody, especially all the old timers out in California, are saying, oh yeah, we know where this is going. Well, Bo got that ball rolling, and he put together a World Literature Conference in late 1979. And at that conference, they developed a guide for literature committees. Because he figured at this point they had gathered quite a bit of input from all over the fellowship through the years. A lot of input had been sent into the NA had the World Service Office in California, which was our equivalent to the General Service Office, right? And guess who ran the World Service Office? Jimmy K. Jimmy K was the manager of the World Service Office. He was the manager of it when I came in. The first time my group needed literature, I called the World Service Office, and I got to talk to Jimmy K.
Wow.
And that was a 2-hour conversation because Jimmy K just loved to talk to addicts. He wasn't the most efficient manager of
apparently not.
but he loved addicts. He would learn all about you. He wanted to know about you. He wanted to know about what's going on in your area. This is the kind of guy he was. Beautiful man.
So there's only like 200 groups at this point. In the late 70s, AA is a household name at this point. And just looking at some stuff I'm researching, 200 groups in the late 70s.
In 1978, you're right. 220 groups in 1978. When I come in, there was about 600. Because I guess I get to enter the picture in February of 1980. I go to my first NA meeting. This guy gets me the same way that guy got Roy P. in the back of the AA clubhouse. This guy meets me in the back of an AA clubhouse, and gives me the word about NA. I come to NA. I have one relapse after I get there, and I come back, and my friend George says, get involved. So I get involved, and that group decides that we're gonna stop using the AA 12 and 12 in our meeting, and start writing our own steps and traditions. And I talked about that on the last episode, and we got involved. I had a typewriter and I could type, so I would type up the stuff, and then we run into Bo. We run to this guy Bo and all the literature people at a convention. I'm 90 days clean, still fighting obsessions every single day. I had a hard time with that, but I was in the no matter what club at that point. I'm not going to get high no matter what. I go to this convention. I never had another obsession after that convention, because I met these guys out there that had this. We called it the pure NA message. You know, they were like, yes, you can do this. You can get clean in NA. You don't have to go anywhere else. And I'm like, well, what if you don't have enough meetings to do a 90 and 90? Well, start some.
Right.
We went back to this convention. We started a Friday midnight meeting. We expected maybe 5 people to show up. 25 showed up at our first meeting.
Yeah, just taking a look at the growth of NA at this point from the late 70s to about 93, there's like really explosive growth, 200 to like 19,000.
Yeah.
Okay, from the end of 1980 to the end of 1981, we went from 600 groups, registered groups, to 1,800. We tripled in size in 1 year, 1981, and that type of growth continued. The first NA meeting, that early NA stuff in New York, that went away in the late 60s, and NA couldn't have a meeting in New York City until late in 81, where they didn't.
Yeah, Nelson was going to run for president. Nelson Rockefeller was going to run for president. He was very cozy he was very supportive of addicts, and all of a sudden he flipped on a dime and had to be hard on crime because he thought he was going to be elected.
Exactly right, and that's why they called it the Rockefeller laws. And so when I get clean in 1980, there's no meetings in New York City. There's no meetings in New England. And so I got to be part of helping NA get NA on the map in New York City. These guys in New York, I mean, you got to love New Yorkers. We had a world convention. What happened after they had the first convention outside of California in 1978? They had one in Houston, and from that point on, it would be in different places. And in 1982, there was a convention in Milwaukee, and at this point, there's maybe 3 meetings in all of New York City. They're just getting going. There's 15 addicts that are consider themselves members of NA. They go out to that World Convention in Milwaukee, and they put in a bid to have the next World Convention in New York City. There's only 15 of them. They got 3 meetings, and they win the bid. They win the bid, and so they go back and they're like, oh, "What did we do?"
Yeah,
so
right.
We had a pretty thriving. At that point, we had Philadelphia went from 16 meetings. My first meeting list I ever saw, there were 16 meetings for the Philadelphia area. A year later, we had 81 in Philadelphia. It just went on fire. We pulled out all stops in public information because that took me 2.5 years to even know NA was right in my backyard from the time I started trying to get clean. So I got involved with public information, and we got a spot in Game 6 of the World Series in 1980. For NA.
Nice.
Wow.
And it wasn't pub. It was appropriate. We said, if you want to do drugs, that's your problem. If you want to stop, that's ours.
One of the part of that explosiveness, as you think about it, right, is, that time frame is the perfect time frame, right? Oh, yeah. You came through the 60s, you came through the Vietnam War, you came through a lot of the drug culture of the late 60s into 70s, right? So by the time the late 70s, early 80s came around, you had addicts, young addicts, right? Now you had young addicts who were using for 10 years and looking to try to get out of that to get that monkey off their back. So again, when you look at it, there's this history of explosive drug use over that time frame, and then 10 years later, what is needed is explosive recovery. And
right.
It sounds like NA and the guys, yourself included, steps into this void and hey, just like Bill, hey, there's a lot of people out there that could use our help. Let's get this shit rolling.
It was unbelievably exciting.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Just there's so much going on. I ran into George for the first time in about 30 years back in 2013. We just fallen out of touch with each other, but we're at this convention and we sat there and we're trying to put together everything we did when we lived together in those 3 years between 1980 and 1983. And we're still remembering things that we'd forgot that we did. We were involved with so much, and it was like you didn't think about it; you just did it, And the need was there. New York's got a convention coming. They start having fundraise. They start having these fundraisers. They have what do they call it? Theater of the Absurds. You know, and we go up. I had just my roommate Al had taught me how to play guitar, and I had about 5 songs in my repertoire. One of them was "The Boxer" by Simon and Garfunkel. You ever heard that? That's a New York song, if ever there was one, right? And I got social anxiety at the yin yang, but I get up there, you know, because you do what you got to do for the cause, and I get up there and I start playing the Boxer, and I got a whole theater of New York addicts who chime in, you know, on the chorus, and it lifted me. I didn't need to play again after that. I had my moment, you know, because it was just, I floated out of there. And we did a lot. This guy Danny came down from Connecticut, and we got him hooked up. He started the first NA meeting up there.
And that probably was Pigs in Space. That Pigs in Space is a huge group up here in Connecticut.
He got, I think 81 is when the first meeting got started there. Yeah. And Danny was a neat guy. He was just he'd gotten clean in AA, and then he found out about NA, and you know, we hooked him up. And you know, some of these guys, like this guy Tony D from New York, they camped out with us. You know, they came down and lived with us for weeks at a time, just to absorb as much as they could to go, you know, take it back. And you know, and it was just it was a crazy time. But you know, that's what kept me clean, because I couldn't find a sponsor that had been through all 12 steps, you know. So I got through the first 5, and then it took me until about 4 years clean until I found that sponsor that could take me all the way through, you know, the rest. But yeah, NA really took off, and it had a whole lot of problems, a lot of growth problems. First off, we outgrew that World Service office that Jimmy Kay was the manager of, and a really heartbreaking story is what happened to Jimmy at the very end, because he got locked out of the World Service office. They had made a decision. They had brought in a guy. This guy had been the parliamentarian for the World Service Conference for about 3 or 4 years. He was a non-addict guy, but he was very much a friend of NA, and he had a really good organizational sense and everything. And they asked him if he'd be willing. You know, they kind of decided, you know, they were having a lot of problems getting the literature out, because the World Service Office, one of their jobs is they were the central warehouse for the literature, you know, so they kind of made a decision to you know, elect this guy as the manager. And one of the board members was supposed to tell Jimmy about it, and I guess he didn't, you know. So Jimmy shows up, you know, and he can't get into the World Service office. You know, the guy changed the locks or whatever, and you know, and he dies about a year later. You know, and so it's kind of
sad.
Tale. I got to meet him at the World Convention that was in New York City in 1983, and what a tremendous individual. This guy you could just feel the love with this guy. You know, he loved addicts. He had that bigger heart that, you know, just transcended, you know, I don't know, you know, he had been dedicated for his entire, you know, recovered life to seeing this thing grow. And when it outgrew him, it just kind of was a little sad way for it to end for him. But we always think that he's like smiling ear to ear wherever he's at now, you know, seeing what happened, because NA did really, the growth continued first in this country, but then it just, once we had the book came out in 1983, and once we had the book, just like with AA, that's when the growth really took off globally. I think NA was in like 4 different countries in 1979. By 1989, I think it was in like 35 countries, and then by 1999, it was in 130 countries. And it's in 140. It's like something like 160 some countries now. And ironically, the place that has about a third of the NA meetings in the entire world is Iran.
Huh. Well, the opium
really took off. They had a serious drug problem there.
Right.
And apparently AA had never really gotten going in Iran, because I think the culture, there's a thing about alcohol.
Right. There is.
I don't understand all of it, but AA just never, there was never I guess a call for it there or whatever. But
alcohol is not allowed in Islamic culture. So therefore, if it's banned, of course, if it's banned, nobody would be using it, right?
Yeah. Or admit that they were using it.
Right.
But apparently a son of a prominent mullah or whatever they call their was an addict, and there was a NA member who had some business in Iran, and he just thought, hey, why don't I start up an NA meeting? And I guess this guy's son, they tried a bunch of different things, and this guy tried NA and it worked, and this guy became a champion within the government. They met with the Iranian government, and the government agreed, hey, we're gonna, and they were told by some members of the NA World Board went and talked with them, and they kind of convinced them that we need to just let them do what they do, and not police, and let them do what they do, because what they do works. And they would welcome. I've heard stories of people who went over to Iran, and they were sort of given the hero's welcome by, there'd just be, and they'd go in, they'd have meetings in stadiums and stuff. There'd be thousands of addicts, I've spoken in the last 2 years, I've spoken in Iran about 6 times virtually, where there's somebody who's translating it into Farsi or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable experience. It really is. Just seeing they are so grateful that NA saved so many people there. So it's very, very cool. Very cool.
This is the thing that I think brings us together when you see something like that. You may think of your preconceived notions about the government of Iran or the differences in religion, and you kind of realize, regardless of language or religion or culture, this just cuts across everything. We're all the same when it comes to, if your only difference is getting sober or getting clean, that's the only thing that ends up mattering and brings us closer together, and we can spread a message virtually. That's incredible.
We have a lot of people that we call, since, especially in that first year and a half or so of the pandemic, that term screen clean became a,
right.
I got screen clean, people that came in after March of 2020, I knew some that they hadn't been to a live meeting, and yet they celebrated a year clean. They had sponsors, they went through the steps. I'm sponsoring right now actively about 15 people in 6 different countries.
Wow.
The only reason is I would have stopped at 5 or 6 because I never sponsored more than that. But I've had the luxury of being able to work from home, 4 days a week. Tomorrow morning I go into the office, but up until July of this year, I didn't have to go into the office at all. So I was saving I have 3-hour daily commute when I go in, an hour and a half each way. So it's 3 hours on the road. I find 3 hours a day,
Right.
And so as people would ask me, I'd just check and see if can I find a spot on my calendar because whoever I sponsor, I meet with once a week, for an hour. We do step work, and it's so true, that the sponsor gets as much or more as the sponsee, because this has sustained me because I'm high, I'm a high risk, and my wife's even higher. We're still, we wear masks whenever we go out. She rarely goes out. I go out a lot more, but I'm very careful, but I'm a off the chart extrovert, I mean, I never knew that until I got clean, and about 11 or 12 years into recovery, I discovered, oh my God, I'm just a natural extrovert. So I do thrive on being around people, and I've just learned to get used to this environment, and this works for me. When I do get a chance to be around somebody in person, oh my God, my energy level goes off the chart. Because it's
nice.
It's like this fresh thing. I love that. I love going in on Thursday because I see real people.
Yeah, that human contact is something.
Oh yeah,
there's nothing beats that. But this can work. I mean, the spirit transcends, all those considerations. It does. Yeah.
And I certainly think when you come in, whether it's NA or AA, and there's a famous person within our group, a young lady who came in to our Monday night AA meeting, Hannah, who is one of the one of the early people on the podcast we did here. But same thing with her. Hannah came in, and for I don't know how long, she had never been to a live meeting, right?
9
Because
months.
yeah, and she, and it worked, right? It worked for her. And so I think if you come into it, especially early on, and you have success, that it becomes natural for you, right? It's like, it's not different like the AA, the people, if you've been going to meetings for 20 years and then you have to do it, some people can't make that leap. They can't make that adjustment. But when you come in and that's the only thing available is a Zoom meeting or some type of video meeting, it's natural, and you're grateful and thankful that meeting was there. So yeah, I can see that would work well, and people would really embrace it.
I'm closing in on 3 years of doing all my work, talking to my people on Microsoft Teams. At a certain point, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx has just become a normal part of our culture that most people have some experience with. So this whole idea that has to shut down, to me, is a bunch of crap. It is another tool for you to be connected, if that works for you, or to supplement it.
Well, and as our people in recovery age, we get a lot of people. One of my best friends was really a shut-in for the last I'd say close to 20 years, because he had cerebral palsy his whole life, but he had just his physical health had reached a point where he just couldn't. It was too much to try and get everything, and just going out to a meeting or whatever. I mean, I used to take him to ball games and stuff, and that was a real chore, but we just loved it. But his last 2 years, he died in November of last year, but his last 2 years, he got to connect again with people, and it's like he came back to life. It's not that he was still very much in recovery. He still contacted people. He had a hard time on the phone because, along with the physical limitation, his speech was, he was always hard to understand until you got to know him. And it just was really hard for him on a phone. But in this environment, it worked so much better. And this was a guy who he had written one of the significant prayers that NA has been around NA ever since. I met him through the literature, and just a beautiful man, with a very powerful message. He wrote the pamphlet on addicts with accessible needs. I can't remember how they put it, but it was just the accessibility issues that that a person in recovery might be dealing with, and how you
challenged with. Yeah.
I dropped him down more than one flight of steps back in the day when things weren't accessible.
Oops.
He always took it in good humor, But
Pete, I want to wrap up this way. We know that AA has had a checkered past with addicts being involved. What's NA's view of an alcoholic going to the meeting? How is an alcoholic received?
The same way an alcoholic is considered an addict, And now the one thing that part of that's a really good, that brings up a really good point that I kind of really didn't go into, but in the 80s there became a movement that was called the Purist movement. Okay. And it eventually came with a bulletin came out from the World Service Office about language, and all that, and it talked about how when somebody introduces themselves as an addict and an alcoholic, it sort of blurs the message, because our message is everything's a drug, including alcohol. So we don't want to make one drug more special than another by separating it out. And there are people who get carried away with that whole concept. When you go through a rehab, they're going to say addict and alcoholic. So you're going to come into your first meeting, and the first thing you hear is, "Hey, we don't say that around here." It's like not a very welcoming thing. So
no.
So it had its moments, but the idea is, a guy I sponsor, he actually got clean before I did. But his primary, almost exclusive drug of choice was alcohol. He just felt more comfortable in an NA meeting. When his first couple years sober were in AA, and then when he was from Butler, Pennsylvania. When he got to an NA meeting, he was like, these are my people. I'm home. He related. He had the identification with the addicts more than he did in the AA. So it's an Alcoholics that received. They just that language thing that's not unlike those old timers that used to give addicts hell about talking about drugs. Some NA people do go overboard with that whole purist thing. One of the great ironies for me in my journey was, I was very involved with the literature, with writing the book. I started the whole history movement because that became a movement. The history is a big deal in NA today. It's a whole cottage industry behind the history of NA. It's unbelievable. But the group where I finally found recovery happened to be an NA meeting that still used the AA Big Book. It might have been the last one. They didn't bring it in the meetings. They honored the tradition, but that's what they knew worked. And we hadn't come out with a guide for the steps, and and that's where I found recovery. And so that's I was with that group. Whatever happened to that group, and that group got removed from the NA meeting list.
Oh, really? Okay.
Not because they used it, but because people would then come in, when they're going through the steps, when they talked about what happened, what it was like, what happened, what it's like now. The part of what happened was my sponsor took me through the steps with the AA Big Book. And, if they could have just, been guided not to bring up the Big Book in the meeting, you can tell people about that after the meeting. You don't have to bring that up in the meeting. It probably wouldn't have been a problem, but that got us removed from the meeting list. And that subsequently, I wasn't part of NA for 30 years after that. I went with my group, and we became Addicts Anonymous.
That's old as new.
And we continued to use the AA Big Book.
So all that language of addict, alcoholic, cross-addicted alcoholic, poly-addicted, and all that other stuff. See, it works in Addicts Anonymous.
But and the other thing too, I think, was just the idea that one of the really, really smart things that happened early on was they in the language clarification, they said an addict is an addict. We're not going to say
I agree.
I'm a junkie, I'm a juice head, I'm a pothead, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict. And that worked so well for me. That was already kind of incorporated by the time I got there. If people have been talking about like hard drugs, that wasn't me. At that point, my problem was marijuana and opium. I'd already stopped drinking, but marijuana and opium were my friends, mm-hmm. and they were my friends that weren't working for me anymore,
Pete B, this has been an awesome history lesson. I realized I've given this zero thought and I know so little. I just was searching through Connecticut meetings, and the ones in the greater Hartford area, it's one page from like everywhere from West Hartford to Windsor Locks, up to the state line, over to where I live. So even though there's been explosive growth, this is still a small group. I had no idea how this came about. And I appreciate somebody who was there when this stuff was being written, an opportunity to pick your brain and hear about this. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about another group that you may not know anything about and is there to help you too, if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, this has been great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Pete, John, Steve. Thank you for being here too. And everybody.
Of course.
Always.
We'll see you next week. Bye, everyone. You made it this far into the podcast. That tells me you're a pretty big fan. If you like what we do and you find value in the podcast, consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/soberfriendspod. Your donation keeps us on the air to help out the new guy and helps us defray some of our costs. If you find value in our podcast, please consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/soberfriendspod.